Ever had someone try to take what's yours, right from under your nose, with a smile that could curdle milk? That's the kind of situation I found myself in, not long after my world had already been turned upside down. They say an Englishman's home is his castle. But what about the land it sits on? Land you bought with dreams and sorrow entwined? My name is Arthur Pendleton, and this is the story of how a homeowners association president, a woman whose arrogance was exceeded only by her ignorance, tried to steal a piece of my heart, and how a bit of planning, some unexpected allies, and yes, an electric fence set things right. Before we dive in, let me ask you, have you ever had a run-in with an HOA that made your blood boil? Let me know down in the comments. I reckon we could share some stories. My life had taken a sharp, unwelcome turn 6 months prior when I lost my Eleanor. My wife of 40 years, my rock, my everything. We'd always dreamed of a quiet place in the country, a haven with enough land for her beloved gardens and for me to tinker with my old radios. After a career in military signals intelligence, a world of shadows and whispers, all I craved was peace. We found it, or so I thought, in a 10-acre plot nestled beside the rather upscale Willow Creek Estates. It was secluded, bordered by old-growth forest on 2 sides, and, unfortunately, by the meticulously manicured lawns of the estates on the 3rd. Eleanor had loved it instantly. She'd spent hours planning where her roses would go, the vegetable patch, the little memorial grove she wanted for her parents. We bought it, signed the papers, and then she was gone. So there I was, a man adrift, trying to anchor myself by fulfilling her vision for the land. The house was modest, but the grounds were my focus. I wasn't much of a gardener myself, not like Eleanor, but I knew what she'd wanted. I started with a small memorial garden for her, right near the boundary line with Willow Creek, a spot where the morning sun touched first. It was a patch of wildflowers, a simple stone bench, nothing ostentatious. It was for her. My days were quiet, filled with the hum of vintage wireless sets I was restoring and the melancholy rustle of leaves. I was, by all accounts, an unassuming widower, keeping to himself. My past life, the one filled with cryptographic analysis, strategic planning, and understanding how to dismantle hostile networks from the inside out, felt a million miles away. Or so I believed. The first sign of trouble arrived in a crisp, cream-colored envelope, bearing the ostentatious gold-embossed logo of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I wasn't a member, of course. My property was entirely separate, predating the HOA's existence by several decades. I assumed it was some misdirected notice, perhaps about a community barbecue I wouldn't be attending. I slid it open with Eleanor's silver letter opener. The contents were anything but neighborly. It was a letter from a Ms. Brenda McMillan, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. Her tone was imperious, her language dripping with condescension. She informed me that a recent survey commissioned as part of their Community Beautification and Boundary Harmonization Initiative, the capital letters seemed to shout from the page, had revealed that a 20-foot wide strip of land, currently part of my property, was, in fact, common ground belonging to the HOA. This strip, she wrote, included the area where I had erected an unauthorized and unsightly memorial structure, my Eleanor's garden. The letter demanded that I immediately cease all trespass and unauthorized usage of this land and remove all personal effects, including the aforementioned memorial items, within 14 days. Failure to comply, she warned, would result in the HOA taking all necessary actions to reclaim and secure its rightful property, including legal recourse and the imposition of fines for continued encroachment. A map was attached, a poorly photocopied document with a thick red line crudely drawn, slicing off a significant portion of my land, right through Eleanor's garden. It looked like a child had taken a crayon to it. I read it twice, then a third time. Shock gave way to a cold, simmering anger I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about land. It was about Eleanor. It was about a bully trying to desecrate something sacred. Community Beautification and Boundary Harmonization Initiative? What a load of pretentious twaddle. Ms. Brenda McMillan had no idea who she was dealing with. She saw an old man, probably grieving and easily intimidated. She didn't see the decades of training in meticulous observation, systemic analysis, and the unwavering resolve to defend what was right. She'd just declared war on the wrong signals intelligence officer. My initial shock morphed into a grim determination. This wasn't some minor dispute over a misplaced flower bed. This was a calculated land grab, wrapped in bureaucratic nonsense and aimed squarely at the most vulnerable part of my life. They want Eleanor's garden? Over my dead body. That phrase, usually so melodramatic, felt chillingly appropriate. My grief, a heavy cloak these past months, suddenly felt different, sharper. It was still there, a constant ache, but now it was laced with a purpose beyond simply getting through the day. I spread the HOA's letter and their amateurish map on the large oak table in my study, the same table where Eleanor and I had pored over the original deeds and surveys before buying the property. Her reading glasses still lay beside the blotter. I picked them up, a wave of sorrow washing over me, quickly followed by a surge of protective fury. "All right, Eleanor, my love," I murmured to the quiet room. "Let's see what these charlatans are up to." My military training kicked in. Rule 1, know your terrain. Rule 2, know your enemy. Rule 3, exploit their weaknesses. Brenda McMillan and her HOA were now officially designated hostile actors. I retrieved my own set of documents from the safe. The original deed, clear and unambiguous, with its metes and bounds descriptions meticulously recorded. The official survey map, professionally drawn and certified, showing my property line exactly where I believed it to be, a good 30 feet beyond where Eleanor's memorial garden ended. I even had high-resolution satellite imagery I downloaded before the purchase, time-stamped and clear. There was no ambiguity. My property line was marked by an old, overgrown stone wall, a relic from a previous farmstead, clearly visible in all the documentation and on the ground. The HOA's letter mentioned a new survey. I walked the perimeter of my land, my old Wellington boots crunching on fallen leaves. Sure enough, near Eleanor's garden, almost hidden in the undergrowth, but well inside my property, were new survey stakes. Bright pink plastic ribbons fluttered from them. Each stake bore a small, almost apologetic tag. Precision Plots Incorporated, surveying with integrity. Integrity, my foot, I thought. More like surveying with intent to defraud. I photographed the stakes, their position relative to the old stone wall and the memorial garden. Meticulous documentation was second nature. Back in my study, I began to research Brenda McMillan. The internet, a vast ocean of information if you knew how to navigate it, quickly yielded results. Several articles from local community papers painted a picture of a woman obsessed with control, a petty tyrant who fined residents for the color of their curtains or the length of their grass. There were disgruntled comments on neighborhood forums, veiled complaints about her high-handedness and opaque financial dealings within the HOA. She seemed to thrive on power, however small the kingdom. Precision Plots Incorporated was next. A quick search revealed a relatively new company with a surprisingly flashy website for a local surveyor. Their testimonials were glowing, but mostly from developers. One name, McMillan Development Group, appeared more than once. Interesting. A little more digging showed that McMillan Development Group was run by Thomas McMillan, Brenda's husband. The pieces began to click into place. This wasn't just about a strip of land. This smelled of something coordinated, something rotten. My old commanding officer, Colonel Davies, a man whose wisdom I still carried with me, used to say, "Pendleton, most bullies are cowards. They rely on bluster and the assumption you'll back down. Call their bluff, but make sure you're holding a royal flush when you do." I wasn't holding a royal flush yet, but I had a very strong hand, and I knew how to play it. The initial reconnaissance was complete. Phase 2 would be gathering more intelligence, and if possible, finding allies. Brenda McMillan thought she was dealing with a grieving old man. She was about to find out how wrong she was. The fight for Eleanor's garden, for my land, had truly begun, and I intended to win. A few days later, while I was carefully oiling the mechanisms of a vintage Marconi radio, a task that always calmed my nerves, an unfamiliar number appeared on my telephone's caller ID. I usually let unknown calls go to the answering machine, but something made me pick this one up. Mr. Pendleton? A hesitant, elderly voice inquired. Speaking, I replied, my tone neutral. My name is George Henderson. I live in Willow Creek Estates. I heard Brenda McMillan is causing you some bother over your boundary line. News travels fast in these communities, I thought. You could say that, Mr. Henderson. Call me George, please. Look, I'm not one for gossip, but I've had my own run-ins with Madam President. There was a distinct note of disapproval in his voice when he said, Madam President, she's a tyrant in a twin set. I'm a retired civil engineer. I know a thing or two about surveys and land rights. If you'd be willing, I might be able to offer some perspective and perhaps a bit of quiet advice. Here was a potential ally, an insider. George, I said, a warmth creeping into my voice. I would appreciate that very much. Would you be amenable to a cup of tea? I'm afraid my biscuits are store-bought these days. George chuckled. Store-bought is fine, Arthur. It's the company and the cause I'm interested in. George Henderson turned out to be a godsend. He was a spry man in his late 70s, with sharp eyes and a mind that was clearly still very active. Over tea and digestive biscuits, he laid out the internal politics of Willow Creek. Brenda McMillan had consolidated power through a combination of aggressive tactics, manipulation of bylaws, and a small, loyal clique of supporters who benefited from her reign. He confirmed my suspicion about Precision Plots Incorporated. They'd received several lucrative contracts from the HOA since Brenda's husband's company had started recommending them. George himself had questioned some of Brenda's lavish spending on community enhancement projects that seemed to primarily benefit her preferred contractors, and he'd been summarily dismissed as a troublemaker. She's trying to create a little fiefdom, Arthur, George said, stirring his tea. In your land, that lovely, wild strip, it offends her sense of order. Plus, he leaned in conspiratorially, I heard a whisper she wants to expand the community meditation garden there. It's her pet project, mostly a spot for her to hold court with her cronies and show off to visitors from other HOAs. Your land is an inconvenience to her ambition. While George provided the institutional knowledge, another, younger ally emerged from the digital ether. I'd posted a heavily anonymized query on a local online forum asking about experiences with Precision Plots Incorporated. A user named Gnome Avenger responded, detailing a ridiculous series of fines from the Willow Creek HOA for unapproved decorative statuary, garden gnomes, to be precise. Gnome Avenger turned out to be Sarah Chun, a young software developer who lived a few streets down from George. She was tech-savvy, quietly furious about Brenda's petty tyrannies, and, as it happened, very good at online investigations. Sarah and I met discreetly. She was in her early 30s, sharp and articulate. Brenda McMillan is a digital dinosaur who thinks a strongly worded email is high-tech warfare, Sarah told me, a wry smile playing on her lips. She has no idea how much of a footprint she and her husband leave online. Together, we delved deeper. Sarah's skills were impressive. She unearthed connections between Thomas McMillan's development company, Precision Plots Incorporated, and a local councilman, Alastair Finch, to whom Brenda often boasted of her influence. Campaign finance records showed donations from both McMillan Development and the owner of Precision Plots to Finch's re-election fund. It wasn't illegal, not on its face, but it painted a picture of a cozy network. My own Sigen experience came into play as I analyzed the patterns. The land grab wasn't just ego. It was potentially about facilitating a future deal, perhaps a rezoning variance that Councilman Finch could help with if the HOA presented a united, beautified front. Eleanor's Memorial Garden was simply collateral damage in their larger game. Sarah also found a private Facebook group for concerned Willow Creek residents, where people anonymously vented about Brenda's iron fist, the escalating fees, and the lack of transparency in how HOA funds were spent. The discontent was widespread, but fear of retribution kept it submerged. As our investigation progressed, Brenda McMillan, clearly irritated by my lack of immediate capitulation, decided to escalate. Another letter arrived, this one more overtly threatening. It cited daily fines of $100 for continued unauthorized occupation and stated that if the land was not cleared within 7 days, the HOA would engage contractors to rectify the situation at your expense. The very next morning, I was drinking coffee on my porch, looking out at Eleanor's wildflowers, when a large, noisy truck from Brenda's Bloom's Landscaping, a company I later learned was owned by Brenda's sister-in-law, pulled up to the edge of the disputed strip. 2 men got out, carrying chainsaws and heavy-duty brush cutters. I walked calmly towards them, my heart pounding but my face, I hoped, a mask of composure. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice polite but firm. "May I ask what you're doing?" The larger of the two, a burly man with a sullen expression, gestured vaguely. "Got orders to clear this brush. HOA land." "Actually," I replied, pulling a folded copy of my deed and certified survey from my jacket pocket. "This is private property. My private property, and you are about to trespass. I suggest you consult with your employer before you proceed." They looked at the documents, then at each other, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. They were clearly just following orders, not invested in the fight. We're just supposed to clear it," the first man mumbled. "And I'm telling you that if you set 1 foot on my land with that equipment, I will call the sheriff and have you charged with trespassing and destruction of property." I'm sure Ms. McMillan wouldn't want her preferred landscapers to have a police record, would she? The men exchanged another glance. The mention of the sheriff seemed to do the trick. Without another word, they packed up their tools and drove away. I watched them go, a small victory, but I knew it was just a skirmish. Brenda would be furious. And she was. A few days later, George called. "Arthur, you need to know. Brenda held an impromptu emergency briefing last night. Not even a proper meeting, just her core group. Sarah managed to get a recording on her phone from outside the door. Brenda was incandescent. Called you an uncooperative recluse, a blight on the community aesthetic, and swore she'd have that land, and your tacky little shrine, bulldozed if it was the last thing she did. She's boasting to everyone that it's a done deal." A blight? Eleanor's memory a blight? The cold anger I'd felt before intensified into a glacial resolve. Brenda McMillan was not just arrogant. She was cruel. And her overconfidence would be her undoing. She had escalated. Now so would I. The recording Sarah had managed to capture, though muffled, was damning. Brenda's voice, shrill and contemptuous, was unmistakable. "He's just some senile old fool who thinks he can stand in the way of progress. That land will be ours, and his little pile of weeds will be gone by month's end. I'll see to it personally." Progress, I thought grimly. Her definition of progress seems to involve theft and desecration. It was time to move from intelligence gathering to strategic action. George, Sarah, and I convened in my study, the scent of old books and solder mingling with the aroma of Sarah's surprisingly good homemade scones. We spread out my maps, George's notes on HOA bylaws, and Sarah's printouts of online data. "She's overplayed her hand," George said, tapping the transcript of Brenda's rant. "This kind of talk, if it gets out, will alienate even some of her lukewarm supporters. But she's also likely to dig in her heels. We need a multi-pronged approach," I stated, channeling decades of operational planning. "First, legal fortification. George, you mentioned a sharp young property lawyer. Eleanor Davies' granddaughter, actually. Young Amelia Davies. Bright as a button, and she doesn't suffer fools gladly. Specializes in property disputes. Knowing her grandmother, she probably inherited a strong sense of justice too." George smiled faintly. "Eleanor Davies. A good name." "Excellent. I'll contact her tomorrow," I said. Second, physical demarcation. We need to make it unequivocally clear where my property line is in a way that's impossible to ignore and legally defensible. Something that says this far and no further. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Like what? A brick wall?" A faint smile touched my lips. "Something a little more shocking. I'm thinking an electric fence. Low voltage, of course, the kind used for livestock. Perfectly legal on one's own property with appropriate signage. It's not about actually harming anyone. It's about the psychological impact. It's a very clear statement." George chuckled. "An electric fence. Oh, Brenda will have kittens. I love it." Third, I continued information warfare. We have Brenda's rant, Sarah's research on precision plots, and the councilman, my irrefutable deeds. We need to package this and be ready to deploy it. And fourth, a community counteroffensive. George, Sarah, you know the residents. Can you discreetly share some of what we've found with those who are already disgruntled? Build internal pressure against Brenda. Sarah nodded eagerly. The concerned Willow Creek residents group will eat this up. Anonymously, of course, at first. George stroked his chin. Many people are afraid of Brenda, but if they see she's vulnerable, if they see someone standing up to her successfully, they might find their courage. The plan felt solid. It relied on truth, legal process, and a dash of psychological maneuvering. As expected, Brenda didn't remain idle. Word of my inquiries, perhaps even my meeting with George, must have reached her. She tried to fast-track a vote at the next official HOA meeting to formally absorb the disputed parcel and approve a hefty budget for its development into a premier community meditation space. She also, true to form, filed a nuisance complaint against me with the county, citing my unsightly natural property line, essentially complaining that my land looked like actual countryside and not a putting green. The county inspector who visited was polite but clearly unimpressed with the complaint, especially when I showed him my well-maintained, if natural, boundary. He left with a shrug, muttering something about busybodies. Then came the more direct harassment. An anonymous tip, which I strongly suspected originated from Brenda herself, led to a county zoning inspector arriving at my doorstep, clipboard in hand, looking for any possible violation. He spent an hour meticulously going over my property, checking setbacks, outbuilding permits, even the wiring on my radio antenna. Fortunately, my military precision extended to my personal affairs. All my permits were in order, everything up to code. The inspector, visibly annoyed at what was clearly a malicious and time-wasting complaint, finally gave up. "Everything seems to be in order here, Mr. Pendleton. Sorry to have bothered you." "No bother at all," I replied calmly, though my fists were clenched. "She's trying to wear me down, to intimidate me with bureaucratic weaponry." Amelia Davies, my newly retained lawyer, was as sharp as George had promised. She was young, yes, but her eyes held a keen intelligence and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me, oddly, of my old CO. When I laid out the situation and my evidence, her expression grew increasingly grim. "This is outrageous, Mr. Pendleton," she said, her voice crisp. "This survey from Precision Plots Incorporated is highly suspect, especially given the connections you've uncovered. In Ms. McMillan's actions, they border on harassment and potential slander, not to mention attempted conversion of property. She warned me that Brenda might try to get a temporary injunction to prevent me from using the disputed land or even from installing my fence. We need to act decisively." The stakes were rising. Brenda was escalating her attacks, trying to use the system against me. But she was also making mistakes, becoming more brazen, more arrogant. And arrogant people, in my experience, often fail to see the carefully laid trap until it's too late. The electric fence components arrived by courier. I spent a weekend methodically installing the posts, stringing the wire, and putting up the bright yellow warning signs. Private property. Electric fence. Keep out. I made sure it was all just inside my true, legally defined property line, leaving no room for argument. It wasn't a high-voltage monstrosity, just a standard agricultural fence, but it looked formidable. It was a clear, unambiguous statement. Eleanor's garden was now visibly protected. The day after the fence was completed, Amelia Davies sent the first salvo. A sharply worded cease and desist letter was delivered by courier to Brenda McMillan personally and to each member of the Willow Creek Estates HOA board. It was a masterpiece of legal precision. It laid out my irrefutable claim to the land, supported by copies of my original deed and the certified survey. It detailed Brenda's harassment. It demanded an immediate retraction of their claim, a public apology, and a cessation of all further interference, all within 48 hours. Crucially, it put Precision Plots Incorporated on notice, mentioning their irregular survey and hinting at a formal complaint to the State Surveyor's Licensing Board, along with potential civil action for damages and professional negligence. The letter also subtly pointed out that HOA board members could be held personally liable for knowingly acting on fraudulent information. The fuse was lit. The HOA monthly meeting was scheduled for the following evening. Brenda, according to George, had planned it as her victory celebration, the night she would formally annex my land. She was in for a rude awakening. The Willow Creek Estates Community Hall buzzed with an unusual energy. Word of the cease and desist letter, or at least rumors of it, had clearly circulated despite Brenda's likely attempts to suppress it. I saw George near the entrance, giving me a subtle nod. Sarah was further inside, phone discreetly in hand, ready to record. Amelia Davies and I waited until the public comment section of the agenda, which, conveniently for us, was when Brenda intended to push through her land grab resolution. Brenda McMillan, resplendent in a power suit the color of dried blood, called the meeting to order. Her voice was confident, almost smug. She launched into a florid speech about community enhancement, shared green spaces, and the generous expansion of the meditation garden thanks to the recent boundary clarification. She didn't mention my name, only referring to an adjacent, uncooperative landowner. When she opened the floor for discussion on her resolution to formally integrate the newly clarified common land parcel, Sarah Chin stood up. Her voice was calm, but carried clearly. Ms. McMillan, before we vote, could you please inform the members about a legal letter you received yesterday regarding this very parcel of land? A cease and desist, I believe, from Mr. Arthur Pendleton's attorney. A murmur went through the room. Brenda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. That is a private matter, Ms. Chun, and irrelevant to this vote. It's merely a bullying tactic from someone who refuses to accept the clear findings of a professional survey. A professional survey from Precision Plots Incorporated. George Henderson's voice boomed from the back. He stood tall and dignified. A company whose principal has rather close ties to your husband's development firm, Brenda? A company whose work has been questioned before? I believe several residents here have had interesting experiences with their boundary markers. More murmurs. Brenda's face was now flushed. That is slander, George. This survey is perfectly legitimate. She gestured towards a nervous-looking man in a cheap suit sitting near the front. Mr. Albright, the owner of Precision Plots Incorporated, evidently present to lend his expert endorsement. This was our cue. Amelia Davies and I walked to the front of the room. Actually, Ms. McMillan, Amelia said, her voice cool and authoritative, the legitimacy of that survey is precisely what's in question. The room fell silent. All eyes were on us. Brenda looked as though she'd swallowed a wasp. Who are you? This is a private HOA meeting. I'm Amelia Davies, counsel for Mr. Arthur Pendleton. Amelia replied smoothly. And since your agenda directly concerns his property, and indeed proposes to unlawfully seize it, he has every right to be heard, as do these residents, who are being asked to vote on a resolution based on potentially fraudulent information. Amelia was magnificent. Calmly, methodically, she laid out Arthur's case. She produced enlarged copies of my original deed, the 1950s certified survey map, and stunningly clear satellite imagery spanning 20 years, all showing the old stone wall as my undeniable boundary. Then, she presented the preliminary report from a highly respected, independent surveyor I had hired. This report, Amelia announced, not only confirms Mr. Pendleton's property line exactly as his deed states, but also flags, and I quote, significant anomalies and deviations from standard practice in the survey commissioned by this HOA from Precision Plots Incorporated. Mr. Albright from Precision Plots went pale. He started fidgeting with his tie. Amelia wasn't finished. Furthermore, she said, her gaze sweeping the room, we have evidence of a campaign of harassment against Mr. Pendleton and statements made by Ms. McMillan indicating a premeditated intent to acquire this land regardless of its true ownership. She then played a short, crystal-clear audio clip from Sarah's phone, Brenda's voice, unmistakable in its arrogance. That land will be ours, and his little pile of weeds will be gone by month's end. I'll see to it personally. Gasps rippled through the audience. Brenda's face was a mask of fury and dawning panic. She tried to interrupt, sputtering about out-of-context recordings and personal vendettas. Some of her known allies in the room began to heckle, trying to shout Amelia down. For a tense moment, it felt like sheer volume and belligerence might derail the proceedings. The other board members on the dais with Brenda looked deeply uncomfortable, exchanging worried glances. The air crackled with tension. Would they back Brenda's bluster, or would reason prevail? The audio clip of Brenda's boastful, contemptuous rant hung in the air like a foul odor. It was the tipping point. The residents of Willow Creek Estates might tolerate a firm hand, even an overzealous president, but naked dishonesty and blatant disrespect for a neighbor's rights, especially when laid bare so clinically, was another matter entirely. Mr. Albright, the owner of Precision Plots Incorporated, visibly sweating under Amelia Davies's steely gaze and her pointed mention of the state licensing board and potential professional misconduct charges, suddenly found his voice. It was several octaves higher than before. "Ah, Ms. McMillan, Ms. Davies, listening to this, it's possible, remotely possible, of course, that there might have been a clerical error in the transcription of the field data for that particular survey. A miscalculation. We at Precision Plots always strive for accuracy. We would, of course, be happy to reevaluate the survey data for the HOA at no additional charge to ensure absolute clarity." His capitulation was so abrupt, so complete, it was almost comical. It was the sound of a rat deserting a sinking ship. A wave of murmurs, this time tinged with disbelief and a dawning sense of outrage directed at Brenda, swept the room. The foundation of Brenda's claim had just crumbled into dust, live and in public. Brenda McMillan stared at Albright, her mouth agape, her face a mottled purple. She looked utterly betrayed, but more than that, completely exposed. Her carefully constructed facade of authority was shattering before her eyes. George Henderson seized the moment. A clerical error? For a 20-foot land grab? Brenda, what else have you been telling us that's based on such clerical errors? What about the budget for this meditation garden on land that clearly isn't ours? What about the other contracts with Precision Plots? Other residents, emboldened by George, Sarah, and the undeniable evidence, began to speak up. Questions flew, sharp and pointed, not just about my land, but about HOA finances, about secretive decision-making, about the constant fines in Brenda's autocratic style. The tide hadn't just turned, it was a tsunami. The HOA board members, visibly panicked at the mention of personal liability from Amelia's letter and the palpable anger in the room, quickly distanced themselves from their president. The motion to absorb my land was not just defeated. It was withdrawn so fast it left a vacuum. The board member acting as secretary stammered out a proposal to indefinitely table any discussion of the boundary and to commission a fully independent review of all recent surveying contracts. It passed unanimously, with Brenda abstaining, her face frozen in a rictus of fury. My vindication was immediate and absolute. Amelia, and I didn't even need to say another word. The truth, backed by meticulous preparation, had done its work. As we left the community hall, the sounds of a full-blown insurrection against Brenda's leadership were just beginning. The fallout for Brenda McMillan was swift and brutal. Within days, a recall petition, spearheaded by a newly invigorated George Henderson and a triumphant Sarah Chun, was circulating throughout Willow Creek Estates. It garnered signatures at an astonishing rate. Precision Plots Incorporated formally retracted its erroneous survey of my property line and issued a groveling apology to both me and the HOA. Though not before Mr. Albright's clerical error, excuse became a running joke in the community. The HOA board, desperate to avoid further legal trouble and public humiliation, sent me a formal letter of apology, drafted by Amelia Davies and reluctantly signed by all members, including a now-deposed Brenda, who had reportedly fought tooth and nail against putting her name to it, but was eventually pressured into it by the threat of being named solely in any future litigation. Eleanor's memorial garden was safe. My land was secure. The electric fence, which had only been active for a few days, became a local legend. I often saw neighbors slow down as they passed, pointing it out. It became a symbol not of aggression, but of defiance against petty tyranny. I rarely even bothered to switch it on after the first week. Its mere presence and the story behind it was deterrent enough. Brenda McMillan's reign of terror was over. She was officially recalled as HOA president by an overwhelming margin in a special meeting a few weeks later. A new, more reasonable board was elected, with George Henderson agreeing to serve as an interim advisor to ensure transparency and fairness were restored. One of their first acts was to terminate all contracts with Precision Plots Incorporated, which was already facing a stringent investigation by the State Surveyor's Licensing Board, thanks to a detailed complaint filed by Amelia Davies on my behalf. Councilman Alastair Finch, suddenly finding his name linked to a discredited surveyor and a disgraced HOA president, became noticeably less accessible to developers. The atmosphere in Willow Creek estates changed. People started talking to each other more, questioning things, participating. Sarah Chun, the Gnome Avenger, was even elected to the new HOA board, promising to bring common sense and a resident-focused approach. She still brought me cookies sometimes, a small, sweet reminder of our unlikely alliance. For me, life settled back into a quiet rhythm, but it was a different kind of quiet. The raw edge of grief for Eleanor remained, of course, but it was now overlaid with a sense of peace and a quiet satisfaction. The battle for the land had, unexpectedly, forged new connections. I found myself occasionally chatting with George over the fence, my perfectly legal, entirely symbolic electric fence. We'd discuss his roses or my latest radio restoration. He'd update me on the HOA's progress toward sanity. Eleanor's memorial garden flourished. I spent more time there, weeding and planting, finding a solace in the soil I hadn't expected. I knew she would have been proud. Not of the fence, perhaps. She was always a pacifist at heart, but proud that I had protected our dream, the little piece of earth that held so much of her spirit. She would have appreciated the methodical way the truth had been brought to light. Sometimes, when I looked at the neatly strung wires of that fence, I'd reflect on the whole affair. It wasn't really about the electricity, was it? It was about drawing a line, clearly and firmly, against arrogance and abuse. It was about the power of meticulous preparation, the strength found in unexpected alliances, and the simple, enduring force of truth. Brenda McMillan had underestimated me, seen only a quiet old man. She failed to see the resolve forged by loss and a lifetime of strategic thinking. She learned, the hard way, that even the quietest people will fight for what they hold dear. Justice, I mused, doesn't always come easily. Sometimes it needs a catalyst, a clear boundary, and perhaps just a little bit of a shock to the system to wake people up. What do you think? Has standing your ground ever led to unexpected positive changes in your community or life? I'd be interested to read your thoughts in the comments below. For now, this is Arthur Pendleton, signing off from my peaceful and properly surveyed piece of the world.